Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast. Today's episode is a special solo cast in honor of Mental Health Day on October 10th. The topic of today's podcast is how to help a loved one who struggles with their mental health. As usual, nothing in this podcast should be considered medical advice. My intention in sharing this topic today is one, to honor Mental Health Day and to shed light on the epidemic of mental health struggles in our society. It's specifically intended to shed light on the people who love those who are struggling with their mental health. It's a hole of need that has not been met by our society. There's very little support for it, very little resources, and very little tools. And so my intention today is bring those people into the spotlight and provide some support and tools. I hope you will discover in listening tools that help. When you change how you show up as someone who loves someone with mental health struggles, it helps the person who you love. Taking care of yourself is the most important and most effective thing that you can do. And I hope that you will leave after listening with some tips, tools, and strategies that can help you move forward. Takeaways are my invitation to be a lighthouse. An invitation to show up intentionally with different energy, helpful energy, to treat yourself with kindness, to tell yourself better stories, to nourish yourself well, and to focus on what's in your control. So I want to start off this podcast with a short reading of something that I wrote years ago during my journey loving someone who struggled with his mental health. And I invite you all to just take a moment and pause wherever you are and take a listen. Choosing to bloom amidst the manure, the cracks of the cement, and loving someone who struggles with their mental health. We get to decide how we show up every day and every moment, especially in the difficult ones. We can choose stories of unfairness or hardship. We can justify our pain and our anger, or we can own it and accept it and allow it. We can feel the pain and move forward with love. We can nourish ourselves with self-care and the breath. We may feel better, but we may still feel lonely or angry. We cannot change our circumstances, but we can choose how we want to respond. We can choose learning over struggling. We can choose acceptance over resistance. We can choose hope over hopelessness. We can choose positive actions over inaction. We can choose to love and feel loved, even when things look different than we think they should. We can choose connection and vulnerability over silence, isolation, and feeling alone. Our power is always in our choices and in our mind. When we allow the pain and the frustration, they move through faster. Everything is temporary. We can choose to remember that after the storm is when the rainbow appears. We can choose to bloom amidst the manure and in the cracks of the cement. And we can even choose to decide that manure is the most nutrient-rich soil for plants to bloom. So today's podcast is inspired because I just finished giving a talk for my alma mater and the women of Dartmouth on how to help a loved one who struggles with their mental health. I am delighted that this is becoming a more mainstream topic, and I'm hoping that by sharing it more publicly here as a podcast, that many more of you will be able to benefit from these tips, tools, and strategies. And the podcast is here to help those of you who have an intimate partner, children, family members, anyone in your life who struggles with their mental health. My hope is to decrease the stigma of the mental health struggles. My hope is to decrease the isolation, and to acknowledge the frustration, vulnerability, loneliness, and isolation in the process. So where I wanted to start is the title of the talk, which is How to Help a Loved One Who Struggles with Their Mental Health. And that title is very specifically named because most of us who care for someone who's struggling very much are interested in helping them. We don't put the focus on ourselves. And so to get people to come to the talk and to get people to listen to a podcast, if the topic is how to help someone else, people are willing and interested in joining. If the topic is how to help yourself or how to take care of yourself, less so. So what I really want to talk about is taking care of yourself and understanding that when we take care of ourselves, that is the most important thing that we can do to help those we love who are struggling. And I learned this the hard way in that when I had a loved one struggling, I did not take care of myself. I went into my type A high achiever, fix it, solve it, manage, control to try to make everything work. I was a busy doctor mom of 3 teenagers with multiple leadership roles. And my family member was struggling significantly. And I found it very hard to step back and take care of myself. My old habitual patterns were to jump in and fix, manage, and control. And so I offer today as my primary message to take care of yourself. By taking care of ourselves is how we can best take care of others. And I want to go well beyond this talk here in putting on your oxygen masks. It's to take care of yourself well, to nourish yourself well in all the ways that we need nourishment as humans. There are no prizes for the most suffering. And this is true when we are trying to help family members. We often step into the victim role. It's natural. It's nothing to be ashamed of, very natural to think about how we are a victim and to think about suffering, and just realizing that even though many of us are saviors, martyrs, helpers, healers, that there are no prizes for the most suffering, and that taking care of ourselves and suffering less should be our aspiration. I also want to offer this idea of being a lighthouse, which I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast as one of my intentions. So lighthouses don't go out saving all the boats, as Annie Lamott says. They're not a zodiac raft going out trying to fix and solve and navigate every small thing. They stand there tall and strong and peaceful and calm, gracefully, I would like to think with compassion, shining their light, helping others navigate through the challenging waters with more ease and more safety. And I think that as someone who loves someone who struggles with their mental health, this is the best analogy I can find. It has helped me tremendously. What I have found through my own experience is that when we change how we show up, our partners and our children and our family members are better able to change how they show up. We create space for them to be the best versions of themselves. I like to offer if and when they can. So sometimes we think, well, I've changed. How come they haven't changed? And the answer is that they may not be able to at this point. They may be doing the best that they can in this moment. And so I like to add, when we are able to change how we show up, others change how they show up, if and when they can. So when we change the energy that we show up with, we create a safer space that has more room for people to show up in the best way that they can. And this is maybe not going to look how we think it should, but it may be better than where we were. And it's honest and transparent. So I did want to share a little bit about who I am. I know many of our podcast listeners know, but I am a board certified pediatrician. I am also a certified coach, and I have worked in the physician wellness space for over 20 years. This podcast is not just for physicians, it's for anyone who loves someone who is struggling with their mental health. And as we all know in the world today, that is almost everyone. So I am also a mom of 3 teens, as I mentioned, who are now young adults, and a yoga teacher who's trained in mindfulness. And I am someone who loves someone who struggles with their mental health. And I am someone who has experienced the isolation, the upset, the bewilderment, the sad, the frustrating. And I struggled to find resources. And so why I am sharing this information is because I want others to not have to struggle so much to find these resources. I went to my old habitual habits of fixing, controlling, managing, people pleasing, trying to make it all work, pushing and doing more, and it didn't work. What worked for me was when I found mindfulness and coaching. And so I wanted to share some of those tools with all of you today. I think of them as human tools, and I think of coaching as human advice or life advice. And so none of this is medical advice. And I want to give the caveat that I'm also not a therapist. I'm here as someone who has lived the journey and found tools that have worked for me, and I'm sharing them with all of you. So it's hard enough when someone you love struggles with their mental health, but most of us actually make it harder by how we respond. And this is not to blame, shame, or guilt any of you. It's to offer hope. We can connect with hope. And that is one thing that I hope this podcast brings and shares with you. It's going to be hard. The circumstances will be there, as I mentioned in my opening reading, but we do not have to make it harder on ourselves. And many of these old thought patterns that we have do make it harder. And so there is a saying that many of our struggles and our pain is our greatest teachers. And I believe that this is true and applies here. And so when I found myself in this situation, I went to a lot of my default patterns, which I see now and understand now made it a lot worse. So when I tried to people please and make everyone happy and solve and fix and showed up with urgency around the situation and fixing it, it didn't help. I also don't like uncertainty, as most of us don't. And that dislike of uncertainty made me nervous, made me uncomfortable, and I thought it was a problem. And so that old habit of not being okay with uncertainty and showing up with urgency caused problems. Some old habits that many people share with me are being a savior, being a martyr, being a helper, being a fixer. And since I am a physician, that is a way that we see ourselves. And when we bring that role of savior, martyr, fixer, and to do so urgently into our family and our relationships, it actually makes it harder for us, and it makes it harder for those we love. And so stepping back and being willing to be patient can be very helpful. Seeing your old patterns and deciding which ones you want to keep and which ones are most helpful to you is an extremely helpful way to help those you love who are struggling with their mental health. So what I want to offer from this point in the podcast is ways to ease your journey going forward. And I see some very clear paths that really helped me, and I would love to share them with you. The first thing I want to offer is this idea of changing your energy. We bring energy to the relationship ourselves. So when we are urgent and frustrated and upset or feeling attacked, we bring that energy. And so my invitation is that there are very active ways in which you can change your energy. You can calm your nervous system and you can nourish yourself well beyond putting on an oxygen mask. And when you show up with different energy, that's what creates space and changes the energy that your loved one is experiencing. And it can make things a lot better for you and a lot better for them. And that's really what I'm offering in this podcast, is that when we make things better for ourselves, it makes things better for those we love as well. I would also invite you to treat yourself with kindness. Many of us use not treating ourselves with kindness as a way to push forward. And choosing to be a victim is not a way of treating yourself with kindness. And so we may be a victim. There may be situations that make us feel like a victim, but choosing that story does not help us. And so I invite you to step out of victim here. I invite you to not be mean to yourself, to step out of those feelings of blame, shame, and guilt, and to instead choose to show up with non-judgment. Choose to show up with non-striving, both common tenets of mindfulness, and choose to tell yourself helpful stories, or at least not harmful stories. The other option is to just tell yourself neutral stories, but don't tell yourself stories that hurt, that make things worse. And we'll talk a little bit about that farther along in the podcast. My next invitation is to manage your mind. This is where coaching comes in, and it is so much easier to manage your mind when your body is relaxed and calm. And so otherwise we're doing it by willpower, and that doesn't really help. So the first step is to calm your nervous system. And I like to make this as simple as pause and presence. And many of you know that that's the name of my coaching business, Pause and Presence. And pause and presence honestly changes everything. In the pause is where you get your control back. And when you love someone who's struggling with mental health, and in the context of mental health, we often feel very, very much out of control. And so pausing and deciding in that space how you want to show up is very empowering. The other thing is that in that pause is where we can notice what's going on. And there is tremendous power in noticing our feelings and allowing them. And so being present with them is noticing them, noticing the stories you tell, noticing the feelings that you have inside, and exploring those, allowing those, honoring those, not resisting them, and then moving forward from there. So nourishing yourself well is the other tool that I mentioned at the very beginning. And nourishing yourself does go to food, but it also goes to rest. It goes to sleep. It goes to clean sheets. It goes to music. It goes to sunlight. It goes to nature, friends, travel, time apart, doing all the things that nourish you and fill you up so that you are not coming from a depleted and reactive state, because that helps no one. And when we react, we are not taking advantage of the pause. And so the reaction usually results in thoughts and behaviors that don't make the situation better. So while it may seem selfish to nourish yourself well, nourishing yourself well is actually selfless. It's something you can do that helps you and helps the one that you love who may be struggling. My next invitation is to honestly and directly not be mean to yourself. So that is showing up with kindness. And I mentioned a few ways in which you can not be mean to yourself, but thinking about making a commitment to do this, noticing the mean stories, noticing how you show up with shame, blame, and guilt, and the cost of shame, blame, and guilt. Notice when you tell yourself it's your fault, when you ask yourself bad questions, when you catastrophize, when you show up with urgency when it's not needed, and realizing that you can also be mean to yourself about being mean to yourself. And so tapping into kindness. What does grace and compassion look like? What does love look like for you and for everyone else? Hand to heart is the next tool that I want to share. And it's something that I share in almost all of my yoga classes, and I share it in coaching. And it is as simple as placing both hands on your heart. It's a technique that I borrowed from Shauna Shapiro in her book, Good Morning, I Love You. And there's science around hand to heart and some recent studies that show that hand to heart actually releases oxytocin and decreases the cortisol in your saliva. So it has physiologically calming effects. When we are in shame, blame, and guilt, we actually release cortisol and norepinephrine, and it makes it hard for us to see clearly and move forward with intention. It shuts down our amygdala. When we activate our parasympathetic nervous system by pausing, practicing mindfulness, doing hand to heart, we can make things significantly better. And so hand to heart is one simple way of practicing mindfulness. Some other ways of practicing mindfulness that I would recommend trying is just as simple as trying any of those apps. 3 minutes, 1 minute between perhaps, when you arrive home from work, before you go into your house, or in the morning before you go into work or when you wake up in the morning, practicing some small form of mindfulness can be magic. You can also practice mindfulness just in nature. Again, keep it simple, but finding that space and taking advantage of the pause is one of the most powerful things you can do for yourself when you find yourself struggling in a situation with someone who's struggling with their mental health. It is by its very nature confusing because mental health involves the brain. And so our brain doesn't know what to do with it. And pausing and calming and connecting to the fact that you have a heart, that you're a human who has feelings and who may actually be struggling with self-acceptance, who may actually be hurting, who may actually be in a tough situation. Allowing all the feelings rather than resisting them gives you a lot of power back. And then getting into mind management. Mind management is the coaching, but when you are relaxed and in this parasympathetic state, it is much easier to rewire your brain and ask yourself helpful questions and show up with intention. So thinking about how you may not be showing up with intention right now, thinking about the feelings that you have, the most common ones that you feel in your life right now. And I invite you here to take a pause and think about what those might be. Write down 3 and sit with them. They are likely not the 3 that you want, but notice what are the 3 feelings that you live with in your life most of all, most often right now. And I invite you here to bring a hand to heart as you think about that question. And when you've figured out what they are, I invite you to think about why you have those feelings. What are the thoughts that you have that might be causing those feelings? And what might you want to think instead? This is one of the most powerful exercises because when we discover what feelings we have and what thoughts are behind them, we can choose. Do we want to choose to continue to have those feelings and choose to continue to have those thoughts? Or might we want to consider choosing some different thoughts that may be just more neutral? Neutral can be a beautiful place to show up. You don't have to be happy about what's going on, but you could maybe be neutral rather than being upset and angry and or making it worse. So I wanted to offer a few thoughts that I found very helpful to bring in different feelings of neutrality, feelings of peace, feelings of calm, perhaps feelings of kindness. And so the first one is that your loved one's behavior when they're struggling with mental health, and actually pretty much any time, is not about you. I use this thought, it's not about me, all the time in many different circumstances, work-related, medicine-related, and with your loved ones. And so remembering that even when they are lashing out, it is not about you. It's a reflection of what's going on in their brain. Our brain tells us it means all of these things about whether they love us and whether they respect us, and whether it's our job to fix it. And remembering that how they're showing up is about them. It's coming from whatever is going on internally. I often like to think that it's not the person, it's the diagnosis, whatever that might be. It's depression speaking, it's anxiety speaking, it's bipolar speaking, it's whatever issue someone might have. It could be ADHD speaking or acting, because I think it's very helpful. We're not giving them a pass. We're giving ourselves a pass to not take it personally and to not have it cost more energetically than it needs to. The other thing is to be willing to sit in discomfort and uncertainty. So we think that discomfort and uncertainty is a huge problem. And what I want to offer is that is actually expected when someone you love is struggling with their mental health. And so the uncertainty doesn't need to be fixed. You don't have to like it. You can accept it and not like it. But you don't have to fix it and solve it and create certainty. What our brain does to create certainty often causes us more pain and makes things more expensive. Discomfort is the same thing. Of course, you're uncomfortable when someone you love is struggling with their mental health. We don't have to be comfortable. We can allow the discomfort to be there. I often say accept and allow. And by merely no longer resisting it, it softens and is much less uncomfortable than it was previously. The other freedom that I found was deciding that I did not have to understand. So we want to understand so deeply, and we often cannot. So because the brain is involved here, we often can't understand what a brain that is struggling with mental health or has a mental health disease is thinking. We can't understand it, but we so want to. We want to put it into our old paradigms and our old thoughts. And so this comes to mind when someone's lashing out at you. We want to explain it in the way that we would explain things, or when someone's brain is thinking differently, we want to explain it in a certain paradigm, but it doesn't serve us well to do that. We don't have to understand why they're lashing out to decide it's not about us. What's in our power and in our control is to decide that it's not about us. It's also almost always not urgent. This one is really, really helpful. And there are rare occasions where it is urgent, but there's a tremendous tax. And we had an episode on the urgency tax recently, and I wrote a blog post about it that really resonated with people. We think in our society that so many things are urgent. When someone is struggling, it's urgent to fix it. But there is something called the urgency tax, and it costs us so much more emotionally and exhausted wise when we show up from a place of urgency. So I encourage you to decide, is this urgent? Can I be patient? What would patience do? That would be a beautiful question to ask. And of course, you feel urgent because when we're uncomfortable, we want to change it. So it's not a problem. Notice, as I mentioned, go back to the pause, and in the pause, notice. That's where your power is. The next tool I want to share here is accept and. And so I find radical acceptance, especially when someone you love is struggling, very difficult. We don't want to accept it, but resistance is incredibly costly. And so when we go to accept and, we can accept and allow, we can accept and not like, we can accept and be angry. There are so many options. We can accept and be sad, we can accept and be disappointed. And when I find, if I allow myself to accept and whatever it is that feels right in that day, I feel much more empowered. And I let go of my resistance, that very costly resistance that makes me angry and frustrated and resentful, and that makes me tired. And so conserving energy for the things that do matter, for the things that you do have control over, is a very powerful tool that helps you, and because it changes how you show up, helps those that you love. Using curiosity well is another beautiful approach. And so curiosity can be strategic. When we use curiosity in unhelpful ways, it causes us pain. Think about asking questions. What if something terrible happens? What if they never get better? What if I can't help? What if it comes back? All of those things are using curiosity against yourself. But if you want to, you can use it in a way to decrease your fear and frustration. It opens up your mind to seeing new solutions. And it doesn't have a lot of negative emotional energy around this idea of curiosity. So using curiosity well, for example, would be to ask yourself, how are you not a victim? How are you not at fault? How are you resourced? How are you handling it well? So I invite you to play with curiosity. I sometimes even say, what would curiosity do? Or how interesting. All of those questions can be super helpful. What if is another form of curiosity, and it can go either way. We can ask ourselves terrible what if questions. What if it turns out badly? Or we can use what if to our advantage. And so what if to our advantage looks like, what if it turns out better than you expect? What if it turns out okay in the end? What if you are doing it right or well or doing a great job? What if it were simple? The other question that I love is, what would love do? And you can put anything there instead of love. So whatever feeling you want to have, and earlier I spoke about feelings. And so thinking not just about what the feelings you do have right now are, but what are the feelings that you want to have, and choosing something that's accessible and reasonable. So you likely don't want to feel happy about a loved one who's struggling, but you might say, what would calm do? What would patience do? What would compassion do? What would your future self do? What would kindness do? What would optimistic do? And so I invite you to pause here for a moment and think about the feelings that you want to have more of, and choosing ones that feel acceptable. Another one I want to offer here is, what would neutral do? So sometimes we just don't want to be reactive. We just don't want to be angry. And neutral can be a very beautiful and accessible place to get to. And so when we feel like we are being attacked, for example, or antagonized, or someone's lashing out, you could say to yourself, what would neutral do? Or you could say to yourself, what would compassion do? And see, realizing that in both of those questions, it's what would it do for you? So what would compassion do for you, and then for your loved one, and then for the world at large? A few others to bring to mind are, what would courage do? What would trust do? What would flow do? And I am a fan of words, as we all know, those of you who listen to the podcast. And so what words resonate with you? What would feel good to feel? And ask that question. Use curiosity to your advantage. And so I invite you to try any of those questions. And perhaps even in this moment, pause, because the pause is where your power is, and be present with how you feel in this moment, allowing it. Take a deep breath. And then think about the possibility in some of these questions. What would love do? What would peace do? What would compassion do? What would your future self do? What would kindness do? What would smart do? What would strategic do? What would optimistic do? What would hope do? What would faith do? What would patience do? What would calm do? What would courage do? What would vulnerability do? What would mindful do? What would trust do? And what would flow do? And just notice if any of those appeal to you, or if you want to put something different in the what would question. And have that in your back pocket whenever you're feeling stuck. I actually like to have 3 or 4, and I pick the one that feels just right. The other one I'm going to throw out, which feels a little bit funny, is, what would a tree do? And this one I find really useful in difficult situations, because trees are graceful and elegant, but they don't go around lashing back. They don't get their feelings hurt. They're very strong. They're rooted. They're tall. They're imperfect, but they're elegant. They survive storms. And generally, we love trees. They do good things for the world. And so I can envision my roots going down and my leaves reaching up towards the sky and standing tall and confident, perhaps, or grounded and calm. And so sometimes even taking it out of a feeling and turning it into what would a tree do can be very, very helpful. So play with it. See what works for you. The last tool that I want to focus on today is focusing on what's in your control. And we very often focus on not what's in our control. And so making a list here in this moment, I offer you a few moments to sit down and write down what is in your control. And I want to circle back to the idea of figuring out what's in your control. Oftentimes we say nothing, and most things about someone else's mental health situation or even physical health situation is not in our control. But what is in our control is what we do, what we say, and what we think and feel about it. And when you sit down and write out all of those things, how you show up, whether you nourish yourself well, whether you up-level your parasympathetic nervous system, whether you practice hand to heart, whether you breathe, whether you choose to be mindful, whether you join me for yoga, whether you get coaching, whether you take time with friends, whether you go for a walk. There are so many things that are in our control, and our brain is trained to think about all the things that are not in our control. So I invite you in this moment to pause, perhaps after listening to the podcast, or make a mental note to do later, to write down the things that are in your control. Because when you do, you will feel some tremendous freedom and liberation. It feels amazing. I also invite you to take a moment to write down the things that are not in your control, that you are trying to control. Usually those are other people, they're outcomes that are out of your control. A lot of the micromanaging, fixing, and controlling that comes from an absolute place of true love is out of our control. And when we try to control things that are out of our control, we cause ourselves pain. We make it harder on ourselves. We often cause ourselves anxiety. I sometimes call it the clutter bucket. But in the case of someone we love who's struggling, it's a very, very painful and very expensive bucket of things when we're trying to control things that are out of our control. And so for me, writing it down and putting a big X through it feels incredibly beautiful. And so I encourage you to do that. And it works for lots of other things in your life as well. And this focusing on what's in your control is an incredibly powerful, empowering tool to make this journey easier. And so I encourage you to enjoy that and try it out. So returning back to the idea of lighthouses, they don't go running all over an island looking for boats to save. They just stand there shining. And I encourage you to think about what a lighthouse would look like. Lighthouses also are kind of a vision around boundaries. And we often wonder about what kind of boundaries to set and when to leave. And I got these questions in my session earlier. And boundaries I like to see as coming from a place of love. And so that tool that I offer, What Would Love Do? That to me is actually a beautiful way of thinking about boundaries. You don't have to create these strict boundaries where no one can come in your space. But if you ask yourself, what would love do? It might walk out. It might speak up. It might decide not to stay. It might decide to stay. And so to me, it gives you back your agency and your control without having to exert a tremendous amount of energy around boundaries. I think there's lots of other work around boundaries with specific mental health concerns that I cannot expound on. But what I have found helpful for me is, rather than focusing on the actual boundary of what's happening, focusing on what love would do. And it guides me to show up as a lighthouse or a tree. You could ask the question, what would a lighthouse do? That's another beautiful vision that takes you out of the energetic negative angst that often comes when you love people with mental health issues. So an invitation also to connect with this question of what would love do as you move forward in your relationship, loving someone who struggles. When we love people who struggle, our job is to show up with love. Our job is not to fix. And so I find that guiding question, what would love do, beautiful. It also invites you to show up intentionally, and choosing an intention is super powerful. So if you want your intention to be love, that's beautiful. What I invite you to do is not have your intention be fear. And so there is a yoga saying, for those of you who know, I always love to bring yoga into these life challenges, is move the way that love would move, not the way that fear would move. And so my invitation for you is to show up the way that love would show up, rather than the way that fear would show up. So as I end this podcast and these thoughts, and as I even finish reflecting, I think there's so much more here to explore. I want to take a moment to honor all that each of us has done to show up for our loved ones who struggle with their mental health, and to pause and also not beat ourselves up for how we have shown up in the past. to know that we did the best we could in the moment with the tools and skills and information that we had. And isn't it amazing that there are these many more tools out there that may be able to help us as we move forward? I also want to invite you to spend some time with some of the questions that I brought up across the podcast today. What are the feelings that you have now? Why do you have them? What are the thoughts that cause those feelings? What feelings do you want to have? And what thoughts might be accessible that could allow you to have them? How could you nourish yourself well? What things nourish you? How can you bring more nourishment in so that you are replete and can pause with grace and compassion? How can you pause more? How might you bring more mindfulness into your life? And how might that help you be the best person to help those you love? How might it heal you? How might it feel better? What might you want to do in your own pause? What story do you want to tell about your current situation? And what is your intention moving forward in your relationship with someone that you love? How would you like to show up? What energy would you like to bring? Can you commit to being kind? Can you commit to nourishing yourself well? Can you commit to managing your mind and thinking thoughts that lead to feelings that feel better? Sending you all love, light, and support. I hope that there is some nugget in this podcast for all of you, that something there resonates and helps you shift your perspective. I invite you all also to join me for yoga. I practice a lot of these techniques in yoga, and I find that it's easier for me to practice them and let them seep into the nooks and crannies when I'm moving and when I'm mindful. And so yoga in and of itself is a way of up-leveling your parasympathetic nervous system. It's also a way to practice some of these mind management tools and kindness for yourself. Many people come work with me as a coach around this topic, and I would love to help you. It is a special passion of mine, and I would love nothing more than to be able to help fill this gap of support for those who love people who are struggling with their mental health. And as we end, I also want to say that there seems to be a hierarchy about which mental health struggles are more or less significant. And it doesn't matter. Whatever you're struggling with is your struggle. And perhaps making whatever the mental health issue that your loved one struggles with a neutral fact. It's a very hard thing to do, but what thought can you think that makes it neutral? Because passing through neutral is an incredible tool that I actually didn't mention. Save the best for last. So if you enjoyed this podcast, please leave stars and reviews, subscribe or follow on Apple, and come back and join us again next week. If you would like to work with me as a coach, please go to my website and send me a message. If you'd like to join me for yoga, the links are in the show notes. If you'd like to up-level a mindfulness practice, I encourage you to join me for a retreat where we do yoga in person. We practice mindfulness, we do coaching, and we nourish ourselves well in all the ways. They're amazing and exactly the respite and rest that anyone who loves someone who's struggling with their mental health needs. So I would love nothing more than to meet all of you in person at a retreat. And if you can't make a retreat happen, coaching on Zoom is also amazingly helpful. And I would love to be there to support you. May you all be well. May you all be safe. May you all be kind to yourself. May you all nourish yourself well. And may you all find peace, love, and calm. Welcome to today's mindful moment. Taking a moment to connect with ourselves and show ourselves kindness. Find your sit bones and connect them to whatever you happen to be sitting on. If you're driving, please opt out. And if you're walking, take a pause and find your feet and connect them to the earth. Taking a moment to find your grounding and your safety. And we'll do a short practice to enjoy feeling calm and grounded and practice this hand to heart technique. So find those sit bones and connect them into whatever you're sitting on. Tilt your pelvis forward, sit up nice and tall, grow your spine all the way up through the crown of your head. Take in a huge inhale, filling up your chest with love and kindness. And a huge exhale, releasing the stress and tension of this topic. And another inhale through your nose. And an exhale through your mouth. And I invite you to practice hand to heart. Bring one hand to top, the other hand to top that. Press the heel of your hand right into that heart space. And see if you can envision the oxytocin, the feel-good hormones circulating around through your body. Give it a gentle press and release a wee bit more and notice how you feel. Take in an inhale through your nose and an exhale through your mouth. And pause for a moment and just notice how you feel. Perhaps ask yourself this question: what would love do? And let the answer bubble up, whatever it might be. You may or may not want to see it or notice it or act upon it, but just know it's there. Taking another moment to take in a deep inhale through your nose and an exhale through your mouth. Sending yourself kindness, acknowledging the stress of the journey, the pain of the journey, accepting and allowing it. And an inhale of hope, then exhale of frustration and stuck. Inhaling looseness and space. And exhaling that angst and tightness. And allow yourself to feel good for a moment. We often don't allow ourselves to feel good. Letting that feel good spread through you, knowing that even as you sit here and let things feel good, all is well. May you all be loved. May you all be safe. May you all be well. May you all be trees and lighthouses and live and love well. I invite you to open your eyes and come back into your body. Release your hands. Hope to see you next week.